Hey everybody, how's it going out there? Welcome to another week of Tasting Together. My name is Pat Fahey. I'm a Master Cicerone and I'm the Content Director for the Cicerone Certification Program. And as we begin every week, Tasting Together, we like to get together and talk about some topic from the wide canon of different beer-related topics. A lot of times we cover beer styles. Last week we did German Pils, which was a lot of fun. Check that one out if you weren't able to make it. If this is your first time here, I always like to say up front, make sure that you ask any questions that you have as we go, because that's the best way for you to get a lot out of these sessions. I won't necessarily get to your questions first thing or get to them right when they're posed. But I try to make sure that I get to everyone's questions by the end of the session. So throw them out there. Talk a little bit about the upcoming weeks. Next week, we're going to be doing Sweet Stout, which includes the Milk Stout style. So if you can only find a Milk Stout, that's fine. That is a totally valid Sweet Stout. I will probably be drinking some sort of Milk Stout next week. September 23rd, we're taking the week off so that I can go judge GABF and Neil can go install a draft system. And then the following week, September 30th, Neil is going to be back to do the very topical Märzen and Fest beer session, talking a little bit about those two styles. And then the last one that we have on the calendar for now is October 7th, where I will be back doing American barley wine, which should be a lot of fun. So this week, we are talking about Gose. And I ended up with Rittergut's Gose. I actually had a lot of trouble finding a non-adjuncted Gose. At this point, nearly all of the Goses that are on the market or readily available have usually fruit added to them. It is a style that makes an excellent base for fruit beer. So yeah, I found a lot of fruited Goses, but I think I had to go to 3 different beer stores maybe to try to dig this up. At least 2. So if you haven't already, let me know what it is that you're out there drinking and whether or not it has fruit in it. I see Anderson Valley Holy Gose. I feel like that one's almost always readily available, but the places that I went to didn't have it. They had the briny melon from Anderson Valley, but not just the straight up one. So in terms of glassware for the style, the traditional glassware, I don't know if you can see it on the label. Yeah, probably. So the original glassware is kind of this rod-shaped glass. It almost looks like a footed version of a Kolsch glass, the Kolsch Stange. I haven't seen a ton of them served in that glassware though, so oftentimes, especially here in the US, breweries are going to use whatever they have on hand. As many of you know, I always have my tulip on hand, so that's what I went with. Let's talk a little bit about Gose history, and I think Gose, has a really fascinating history, in particular just because of what's happened with the style in recent years. But I'll get to that in order. I'll start at the beginning. As far as we know, Gose style has been brewed in Germany for several hundred years. I want to say some of the oldest recorded mentions of the style are from the 13th century. And the name of the style comes from the area where it was originally brewed. There's a town of Goslar, which is along side or close to the Gose River. And so they were originally brewing this Gose style. Over the course of several hundred years, the beer eventually became very popular in Leipzig, which is not too far away. And by the late 1800s, the popularity of Gose in Leipzig had actually eclipsed the popularity of Gose in Goslar. And to this day, the style is more closely associated with Leipzig and Leipzig breweries than it is with Goslar today. Now, like a lot of wheat beers in Germany, the first half of the 20th century was not very kind to the wheat beer style. We saw wheat beers of all stripes kind of decline in popularity over the first half of the 20th century. You look at a style like Weissbier or Hefeweizen, that definitely experienced a serious decline leading into the middle of the 20th century, but rebounded pretty significantly. And at this point, Weissbier is one of the most widely consumed beer styles in Bavaria. Gose did not quite follow the same trajectory. Gose declined pretty precipitously in popularity over the course of the first half of the 20th century to the point where the style basically died out. In between the 1950s and the 1980s, there were a couple different breweries that were sporadically producing a Gose, but the style, there were periods of time where there was no one brewing the style at all, and there wasn't much in the way of demand for it. It was not a terribly popular style. Now, in the mid to late 80s, saw a brewery or two in the Leipzig area sort of bring the style back to life, and slowly over time, popularity in that area grew. So Gose at least had a second life breathed into it at that point. But what I think is the really interesting part of Gose's history is like what has happened with the style in the last decade. So I remember, when I really kind of dug in and started learning a lot about beer, which at this point was about a decade ago, Gose was a historical novelty. You look at the Oxford Companion to Beer that was released in 2010, I believe. There are a couple of passing mentions to Leipzig Gose in chapter or in entries related to sourness or lactobacillus. It doesn't have any entry of its own, not given even a full sentence of its own anywhere in that book. I want to say the first time I read about Gose, I think was in Stan Hieronymus's Brewing with Wheat. And once again, it received, that obviously that was an entire book focused on wheat beers. So it received a little bit more attention there, but I want to say it was still like a page, maybe a couple pages at most on this style. So even by like 2012, beginning of 2013, I'd heard of this style, but I'd never actually encountered it anywhere. And I, especially as a excited young enthusiast at that point, definitely made more efforts to seek out those sorts of things. I remember visiting, I had to do a certified Cicerone exam in Vermont. And I already saw somebody post that they were drinking one of these, but I stopped by a brewery called Lost Nation, and they had a Gose that they were making. And I was like, holy crap, like I get to try this dead style. And so I tried their Gose. It was rad. I enjoyed the beer. I was like, that was really cool. It's really cool to see a brewery kind of like resurrect a dead style like that. And maybe like 6 months went by, and I don't remember who the next brewery was, but like I ran into another brewery. I was like, whoa, another brewery making a Gose. That's crazy. And then, like another 6 months went by, and it was like, whoa, there are like 500 breweries making Goses. Like somewhere in the 2013 to 2014, period of time, the style just exploded in popularity. And it felt like almost overnight, like even if they weren't necessarily packaging it, like every other brew pub or tap room had a Gose on. I'm trying to think, like, in the period of time that I've been sort of paying attention to what happens in the beer world, I guess New England IPA is another style that like kind of just entered the consciousness and then like totally exploded. But New England IPA was a riff off of the already super popular IPA. Gose was like this historic style that was dead for decades, and then everybody was making one. And as I kind of mentioned at the outset of this, at this point, once again, fewer people are making just straight up Goses. At this point, it is a lot more frequently used as a canvas for fruit additions. And we'll talk about the flavor characteristics in a little bit, but the flavor characteristics of this style make it a natural canvas for fruit additions. I would say same thing about a style like Berliner Weiss, which we certainly see more of today, more straight up Berliner Weisses than we might have maybe a decade ago or 2 decades ago. But there are a lot of fruited Berliner Weisses on the market, and it's similar flavor characteristics, particularly lactic acidity, that lends well to fruit. So let's talk a little bit about the recipe for the style. First of all, on the grist. Grist is pretty simple. It's usually going to be Pilsner malt and wheat malt. Most German beers, like you look at the Weiss beer family, in order to be labeled as a wheat beer, it has to be at least 50% wheat malt. I'm not 100% sure if that law applies to Gose, but at least in practice, most of them are at least 50% wheat malt, at least the ones made in Germany. I'm not so sure about the ones made here in the States. Hopping doesn't really matter. I would assume that they're using continental European hops, probably German hops of some kind if it's a German brewery. This style has low bitterness and is meant to have no hop flavor or aroma. And part of that has to do with the fact that it is traditionally made through Lactobacillus fermentation, and a lot of Lactobacillus strains are pretty sensitive to hop compounds. I don't have an exact figure, but I know if you get much north of like 20 IBUs, 20, 25 IBUs, you're not going to see really much of anything in the way of Lactobacillus activity. And even as low as like 10 IBUs for some strains of Lactobacillus is too much. So talking about Lactobacillus, on that fermentation front, fermentation for this style is usually going to be a standard German ale yeast, might be along the lines of something that you'd see used to ferment a Kolsch or an alt beer. And that's usually used in tandem with some strain of Lactobacillus. And I'll talk a little bit about different ways that Lactobacillus can get added to beer when we talk about process in just a little bit. The other things that make this style kind of interesting are its ingredients that sort of fall outside of the canon of typical beer ingredients. And that is 1, coriander for spicing, and then 2, there's almost always salt added to this beer when it's made. And at least what people say is that the Gose River is rather high in sodium chloride, so it naturally lent a salty character to those beers when they were originally made in that region. And over time, other people trying to emulate those beers would add salt in order to achieve that similar characteristic. And I saw that Eric asked a question about range and saltiness, and what my sense of it is, German versus American examples. In practice, with what you see in the market, there's huge range of saltiness present in different commercial examples of Gose. Salt added at very low levels, if it's below the point at which it starts to come across as notably salty, what it often will actually do is it will sort of enhance the sweetness of the beer. The way that it does that, salt has a suppressant effect on bitterness, and I think on acidity, though maybe to a lesser extent than bitterness. And so the addition of salt tends to bring down some of the other tastes, lets sweetness sort of shine above that. So low level salt, before it even starts to taste salty, will enhance the sweetness a little bit and will also make the body feel a little bit rounder, a little bit fuller. Then you get to the point where you have like a lightly salty Gose, and then I've had Goses where it tasted like a salt lick, and I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the most pleasant experience in a beer that I'm looking to consume. My understanding of the style historically is that it generally would have fallen somewhere in one of those first two categories, probably even leaning towards that first category where it was a very subtle saltiness. And I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush in talking about German versus American examples, but I would say that in general, when we in the US do things, subtlety is not the first word that comes to mind for most, for just kind of American brewing in general. I mean, you look at what we've done with hops in this country, and people around the world emulate what we've done with hops in this country because it makes for really delicious beer. But it's not subtle. And so sometimes you'll see breweries in the US that will say, oh, it's a beer, it has salt added, and they will add a lot of salt. And I have not had a German example that was like really over the top salty, whereas I definitely have had examples in the US that are over the top. But that said, I would say you see the full range within the US. I think that there are definitely people in the US that are making the style with a deft hand and producing really excellent and really well balanced versions of this style. So it's not that American brewers can't achieve subtlety. I think lots of them can and do, but we are definitely in our brewing, we tend towards excess more than any other brewing culture that I'm familiar with. I'll leave it at that. So Eric also wanted to know, this was the next thing, you're just like setting me up for what I want to talk about. So wanted to talk about the fact that traditionally this beer would have been made with a co-ferment, or not a co-ferment, like a mixed culture ferment probably, where you're using Saccharomyces alongside Lactobacillus in order to achieve that acidity. What a lot of breweries, particularly in the US, are doing today is they are kettle souring their Goses and other quick soured beers. And the way that kettle souring works, Lactobacillus is a bacteria in beer that it's not supposed to be in. It is a spoilage bacteria. A lot of brewers are kind of wary about having spoilage bacteria live in their cellars because it is very easy for you to accidentally introduce that lactic or Lactobacillus culture into a tank of beer that's not supposed to have it present. And then that is just a dumped batch or a recall waiting to happen. So what kettle souring does that's kind of nice, it really offers two large benefits. One, it occurs entirely on the hot side. So it keeps the bacteria out of your cellar, your fermentation cellar. And two, it's fast. It's really fast. So what kettle souring does is it takes advantage of the fact that Lactobacillus's optimum operating temperature is around like 100, between like 100 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So right around, I think that's about 40 degrees Celsius. And so what brewers will do is after mashing, they'll draw the wort into the kettle, and then some brewers will boil to sterilize at that point. Some brewers will just proceed with the souring process at that point, but they will add Lactobacillus to the wort. I'll talk about different ways that they do that, but a number of different ways that you can accomplish that. And then they'll hold the wort around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that temperature with an active culture of Lactobacillus, it'll sour the beer in about 24 hours, between 24 and 48 hours. So you get a really quick souring of the beer accomplished, and are able to produce a beer that is naturally soured with Lactobacillus, but in way less time than it takes if you had to wait for it to work, at lower temperatures in a fermenter alongside Saccharomyces. And I'm not 100% sure on this, but if I had to guess, I would say the vast majority of American producers of this style are using kettle souring to achieve acidity. So there are a number of different ways that you can add Lactobacillus. Probably the most like by the book one would be to add a culture of Lactobacillus. But some of the other ones that I've definitely encountered, sometimes brewers will just add like a handful of grain. Lactobacillus is a bacteria that is in the air and lives on surfaces and is usually present on the surfaces of barley malt. So just adding a handful of grain into the wort will usually be enough to inoculate it. Risk there is that there could be other bacteria present. And so you could end up with something really gnarly going on. Other things that I've heard, and I've actually tasted some that I thought were really excellent, is I've definitely encountered brewers that used like Greek yogurt or yogurt with live cultures. Yogurt is typically soured by various Lactobacillus strains. So I have known brewers that would pitch Greek yogurt into their kettles and use that as the inoculant and achieve very tasty beers doing that. So, there are a lot of ways to do it. And clarification from Michael on kettle souring. Yes, it's typically mash. So mash, then sour in the kettle, and then you proceed with the boil. And basically the process proceeds as normal from that point forward. And the thing about that is that by doing the souring before you do the boil, you kill, you basically sterilize your wort. You kill anything that was in the wort by boiling it, and then when you transfer it on to your fermentation cellar, you have sour wort, but no live bacteria that you have to worry about. And like I mentioned, sometimes brewers will boil before they sour. Sometimes they will just go straight from mashing into souring. It's kind of like what do they feel is acceptable risk tolerance, because kind of similar to just adding a handful of malt to the kettle. If you just mash straight in, you're usually mashing at temperatures high enough that it'll probably kill most things that could potentially infect your wort, but there are various things that can live at relatively high temperatures. So yeah. One other comment that I wanted to make here, because I thought that this was interesting. A lot of people are familiar with Reinheitsgebot, the German purity law, and I don't want to dig into all the particulars about that. But you look at a style like this, it's got salt added, it's got coriander added. It does not conform to the malt, hops, water structure of Reinheitsgebot. And the thing to remember about Reinheitsgebot is that for most of its 500 plus year history, it was a Bavarian law. It was a law in Bavaria, and so didn't apply to the rest of what today is Germany. And Reinheitsgebot only became sort of the law of the land during various periods of reunification in Germany's history. And Bavaria, in order to be included, wanted Reinheitsgebot to be the law of the land, but various parts of the country where they had their own styles that would not have fit into the Reinheitsgebot paradigm wanted carve-outs. So when you look at the way the law is structured today, it's still about as strict as it was for lager brewing, but for ales, there are a lot of, allowing for addition of wheat and in some cases spices or salts or other sorts of things. So ale brewing is a lot more permissive in Germany. So let's talk about the flavor of Gose. You have a few key drivers of flavor in the style. I'd say the first one is the lactic acid. So that lactic acid produces tartness, tart acidity, and almost gives it a little bit of like a lemony character, I find, especially when you combine it with one of the other key flavors present in this, the coriander, which coriander often, I think, gives sort of like a lemon orange or lemongrass sort of floral citrus profile to things. So that coriander in combination with the lactic acid, I find it often gives the beer a little bit of a citrusy impression. Other things usually that you find in this style, usually the carbonation is pretty high. I don't know how old this bottle is, but based on the color and the level of carbonation and the fact that it tastes a little bit like honey, it's not super fresh. So the carbonation wasn't quite as high on this as I would expect for the style, but a lot of examples of the style will feature pretty high carbonation. So when you combine those things, and people may know where this is going, but when you combine those things, you've got, high carbonation, moderate acidity, relatively low alcohol, low bitterness, you get a style that's very crushable. Like this is another one that is super drinkable. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to hit this style at like the end of summer. Of course, here in Chicago right now, it's like gray and awful out. So it feels like summer is over, but this is another one that if you find yourself on a patio, this is a favorite of mine. So let's talk about a couple closely related styles, and then I'll talk about pairing, and then I'll get into questions. I've often, or when I was first learning about the style and when I will teach people about this style, I like to sort of describe it as almost like the child of Berliner Weiss and Belgian wit beer, because it brings together elements of both of those styles and has a little flair of its own that doesn't appear in either. But you compare this style to Berliner Weiss. Berliner Weiss is just like screamingly acidic with lactic acid. So this beer is usually going to be less acidic than Berliner Weiss, and then has kind of the additions of coriander and salt that separate it from that style. You compare this to wit beer. Wit beer typically doesn't have much in the way of acid. It can have a little bit, but on the whole, Gose is going to be more notably acidic than wit beer. They both have the coriander. The saltiness is also a tell in this style. The salt is one of the things that distinguishes it from both of those styles. I would say also with wit beer is usually going to be a bit paler, because a lot of classic wit beers are brewed with unmalted wheat rather than malted wheat. So, this one isn't even terribly hazy. Once again, I would probably attribute that to its age over time. Some of that haze can precipitate out. And the last one I want to cover, and I saw somebody just ask this, so You guys are, I'm glad I picked out the things to talk about that people want to know. Last one I want to address is Gose and Goose, Belgian Goose from Lambic family of beers. Get this question a lot because the two sound similar, especially because some people pronounce the name of this style as Gose instead of Gose, but it is Gose and Goose. And the biggest similarities between them are that they're both acidic, they both start with G and end with E. And outside of that, they're pretty distinct styles. You know, this is a much quicker souring process used to brew this. Some examples of Gose will, I think historically the style was made with spontaneous fermentation. I read that at least. And, you know, you'll sometimes see Goses that incorporate some like Brettanomyces character, but that's a lot less frequent in this style. I would say those are outliers rather than the norm. Whereas Goose is the product of a, you know, blending multiple vintages of lambic beer that has undergone complex mixed culture fermentation, including Brettanomyces, develops a lot of kind of like funky, earthy, horse blanket barnyard type characteristics, in addition to a wide variety of different esters and flavors that come about as a result of that process. So yeah, they're pretty significantly different. And I would recommend, if you ever feel like you have trouble with the two, like taste them side by side. I really do feel like a lot of the confusion between those two styles stems from the fact that they have similar sounding and looking names. Last but not least, talk about pairing really quick. You know, I look at pairing with a Gose kind of in the same way that I look at pairing with a wit beer. I probably would kind of think about it along the similar lines of wit beer rather than thinking of it along similar lines of Berliner Weiss, just because Berliner Weiss has such an assertive acidity to it. So, you know, compared with a style like wit beer, this also has the notable acidity that is present in the style and not in wit beer. And then also that saltiness, which adds kind of an interesting X factor when working with a pairing. But, you know, similarly, this is a super refreshing style and one that can be consumed in volume, which I always think is a great asset for pairing. It allows beers to take on lighter dishes, but also to work with things that are a little bit heavier to just kind of work as an accompaniment. You know, this is a natural with a lot of kinds of seafood, you know, mussels and white wine, shrimp with olive oil and garlic, you know, lobster tail with a butter sauce, or even like just raw oysters. This work well with a wide variety of different salads that you might want to do. Like wit beer, this would shine at brunch if you wanted to serve it up with like a frittata or an omelet, something like that. But, you know, it would also work with, I can see this working just fine with like sausages or slightly fattier meats. I don't necessarily, I mean, I'll try anything. I don't think that this would be my first choice to pair with something that had a lot of like char character to it, either something that was like heavily grilled or seared. But you never know. I would try it. But I think more like pork knuckle would be a richer meat preparation that I think that this beer could at least stand up to and would be interesting with. All right. So let me see. I got to read through these and figure out which ones I already kind of addressed. Kevin Meyer asked, I've heard that Gose is best enjoyed on the beach. seen a ton of breweries on the coast producing this beer in the summer. Do you feel that this beer is built for that? Based on its history, I would say it definitely didn't come about as destined to be a beach beer, since the city of Goslar is not near any beaches. However, with the salty character to it, I've heard a lot of people talk about how it's like evocative of the sea breeze. And as I kind of mentioned, like, it is super refreshing. It's definitely, for me, it's a patio crusher of a beer. I think it is very well suited to that environment. When I think about beers that I would, if you look at my complexion, you might guess that I'm not like the most frequent hang out on the beach all day sort of person. But if I were in that sort of environment, the things that I would want are like things like this, or wit beer, Berliner Weiss, Pilsner, other things that are kind of like light, refreshing, easy to drink. And I would definitely put this in that category. Let's see, Kevin also asked, does the addition of hops kill off any lacto or ill effects from bacteria? I'm going to assume that you mean like the addition of hops during the boil. And so hops have bacteriostatic properties. Once you add hops to a beer, you introduce an antibacterial component into that beer. And it's not effective against all types of bacteria, but there are a lot of types of bacteria that are sensitive to hop compounds. And once the hops are present in the beer, they won't be able to grow in it. In the case of boiling a kettle soured beer, it's the boiling that is killing off the lactobacillus. Hops, think of hops as preservation downstream. And the thing is the reason why that's important is if you were to bitter a beer too strongly and then were to try to use like some sort of lactobacillus strain during your regular fermentation, depending upon how much you bittered that beer and what the strain was, it might have trouble growing in the beer and you might not actually get a lactic acid fermentation. And that actually, I know I saw somebody else come through with a question about how the acidification process varies between something like this and something like Goose or lambic beer. And the big difference is you're never going to see a kettle soured lambic beer. Those beers are always acidified during their long and slow fermentation and maturation. I've read that lactobacillus does not often play as much of a role in lambic fermentations as other lactic acid bacteria, like Pediococcus, for example. And Pediococcus is something that you would never use in a kettle sour. Pediococcus produces a ton of diacetyl when it ferments things. So okay to have Pediococcus in a lambic fermentation because it's going to produce a lot of diacetyl, but that beer is going to be aging for usually a couple years in wood, and you have active Brettanomyces in there that is going to chew up all of that diacetyl. If you were to do that in like a kettle sour, I imagine you just get like a crazy high level of diacetyl in the beer that yeast may or may not be able to clean up during fermentation. Yeast is really good at reducing stuff. I'm not 100% sure on that, but as far as I know, brewers just stick to lactobacillus strains for that. And kind of that piece that I was talking about hops having bacteriostatic properties that affect some types of bacteria more than others. That's one of the ways that lambic brewers control what sorts of bugs grow in their beer. Lambic beers are made through spontaneous fermentation. You allow bacteria and yeast in the air to inoculate that wort. I've heard from some people that they kind of think of it as just like a totally uncontrolled process, and it's just like the brewers just are lucky that they're in the right place, and if they do it at the right time, it works out. the brewers are able to exert more control than you would think over those beers through the use of specific hopping rates to control what sorts of bacteria can grow, using temperature control during fermentation and maturation to once again control the mix of which organisms are dominant. So there's more control than you might think. Brad asks, are there differences in flavors of kettle sour versus traditional? Not that I know of, honestly. I mean, the primary goal of using a process like kettle souring, or even just a mixed ferment where you're just adding lactobacillus, is just clean lactic acidity. Ideally, if it's done well, you don't get other flavors to it. And that's one of the things that separates a beer from something like a Goose, where the flavors that you get in that kind of beer can really only be built through this very complex fermentation process that has to occur over the course of years. A beer like this, you can produce the acidity, the acid profile that you're looking for overnight. And if you look at homebrew recipes for the style, a lot of them don't even include a lactic acid fermentation. A lot of them will either use acidulated malt or just straight up lactic acid addition to get the acid in the beer. And while that may seem like cheating or something, like, it's the same end effect. The goal of a kettle souring process is just clean lactic acidity. So rarely see any head on sour beers. Does lacto kill the body of the beer, or is it a function of lack of unfermentable sugars remaining? Honestly, there are potentially multiple things going on, but one of the things that I know for sure plays a role is a lot of sour beers are not very highly hopped, and hop isoalpha acids play a pretty significant structural role in beer foam. A few of the main constituents of beer foam are like medium length proteins and hop isoalpha acids, which really help to stabilize foam. And so when you have these really lowly hopped styles, that is going to impact their ability to form a head. It's a great question. Eric wanted to know, is this one good with ceviche or too much matchy-matchy? I would say it depends. I feel like I've probably talked about this like 3 times across different sessions, but I remember doing a pairing with the ceviche where I needed something acidic because it was so bright and acidic that beer without any acid to it just sort of fell flat. I think I used a blood orange Berliner Weiss from Cigar City that they had at that festival. I would say, especially because there are a lot of fruited Goses out there, that if you found one with the right fruit character, that could make for an interesting match there, especially one with citrus, because a lot of ceviche, like citrus, but citrus other than what was used to cook the ceviche, that could probably work well. I still would try it. I think the salt would make for an interesting contrast, and ceviche is often going to have like probably onion characteristics and various herbal characteristics, so there's more flavors going on there. I would say it might be kind of like same or matchy, but it would be worth a try. I bet like the thing about matchy pairings is like they're usually not bad. They're just usually not super exciting. Like I have always thought that the most exciting pairings, the pairings that I look back on and I'm like, oh my God, like that was transcendental. Like, are ones where you'd almost look at it and be like, I don't know if that would even work. But when put together, it just makes for this really excellent experience. And with something that's super matchy, it's kind of like, yeah, they're similar. But that can be really nice too. So in the right context. So I would say try it out. Gaston asks, would you try to use a Gose to bring a non-beer fan friend to the beer universe? It depends what other sorts of things they're into. I think Gose, especially a fruited Gose, makes kind of like an easy entry point. And it's partially about how you position it. I've heard people between like the salt and the acid be like, I think Goses taste like sweat socks. And like, that's really probably not going to set somebody up to enjoy the beer. But if you set it up as like, it's like a lightly salted lemonade, that's something that gives them a familiar touchstone and makes it easy to kind of, bring them in and get them to try it, assuming that they like lemonade. If they don't, then don't use that as a comparison point, and this probably isn't a good beer to bring them in. But in the same vein, I've definitely done tastings for groups of wine drinkers where I've used things like Flanders Red Ale or Creek, which even kind of looks like a red wine, to get people to understand that beer can be a lot more than just American adjunct lager. Greg wanted to know how classify Stone Salt and Lime Lager, and fortunately Shayna just Googled it for me because I don't know the beer well enough off the top of my head. But she said they just kind of bill it as a Mexican lager with salt and lime added. So I wouldn't lump it into this category. I'm not sure what the acid level is like on it. It probably doesn't have coriander in it either, which is, I would say, like a necessary characteristic of a Gose. Somebody asked about pairing Gose with spicy food. Could work. One of the things I talked about, we didn't sample when I did the spicy food pairing, but I mentioned, try acidity, because at least anecdotally, acidity increases rate of salivation, which will potentially help to clear capsaicin from your tongue a little bit faster. So could be interesting. Could work. Not going to say for sure. With beer and food pairing, like nothing really is ever for sure. But it's wet and it's cold and it's drinkable, and that will at least feel soothing in the moment. So I can tell you it will at least do that for you, and it might do even more. I think that's about it. That's all I see in terms of questions. So thank you guys for stopping in and drinking Gose with me. I'm doing like a sort of freewheeling talk with Miguel, who runs account The Beer Trekker, tonight on Instagram Live, I think at 7 Central Time. So if you want an even more casual talk about all things beer, I'll be doing that in a couple hours. But otherwise, hopefully I'll see you guys next week. We'll be talking about sweet stout, milk stout. Should be tasty.